Welcome to Exhorter Podcast, where we aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. Thank you for joining us once again. You're actually just joining Kyle and myself. Nate's expecting a third girl here in just a matter of a week or two. And so he's got his hands tied up with that, and so we gave him the week off.
Yeah, Mrs. Nate is like 10 months pregnant now. And
10 months. Yeah, it's inching there close, and so it's good for him to focus on that right now. But we didn't want to necessarily full stop, so Kyle and I were looking through a couple other topics that we'd been throwing around, and there's a video series that I think Kyle and I are going to try to get out there at some point in time on this subject, but I just kind of encourage Kyle to maybe like a little prequel for the subject, and maybe we can have a little discussion about it. Kyle, what are we going to talk about today?
Which version of the Bible are you reading, and what questions do you have about that? Which translation should I be reading? Is that a question you've ever wondered? Hopefully it is, because it's a very important question. If the Bible represents God's revelation of himself and his will to mankind, wouldn't you like to make sure for certain that you're reading the correct version of that revelation?
Correct version? Kyle, aren't all versions the same?
There is only one accurate version. You got to stay tuned to the end of the episode to find out which it is.
Yeah, let's not tell anyone which ones we prefer until the end. But I do think it's really important to acknowledge that. Is there a perfect version or translation?
No, certainly not. And we are intending on doing a video series where we go in depth on quite a few different versions I've been looking into and kind of comparing different popular translations of the Bible. And we want to go really in depth in a video series, but we don't have time to look at each one individually today, but we can cover some basics. And that's probably the most basic question. Why are there so many different versions of the Bible? If they're all translated by professionals and by Greek and Hebrew scholars, then why do we have so many different versions? That's one of the challenges of the Bible, is the fact that it wasn't like one person sat down and wrote it all at one point in history. The word Bible, it comes from the Latin word biblios, which means books. And that's literally what it is. It's a collection of books. And so as you go through the Old Testament, it seems that Moses likely was the author of Genesis with God's assistance there and inspiration. And Moses wrote things down through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then it would seem that Joshua was intended to take that role. And just as time went on, more and more of the writings and revelations from God were added to the collection of books until we get to the New Testament time. And then you're looking a few decades after Jesus is when the Gospels started getting circulated. And then by the end of the first century, we're starting to see fragments of copies of some of the epistles and the Gospels. But the earliest manuscripts we have of an entire New Testament isn't till around the probably mid-4th century. So you're talking 300 years or so after Christ. But that's pretty remarkable, because there's no other book in history that has manuscripts that still exist that are that close to its original date. I mean, we'd love to have the original letters written by Paul or the original signed copy of Matthew's gospel.
They're in the Vatican.
That's underneath the UFOs.
Yeah, they're locked up.
But that's just unrealistic, and that's expecting more of the Bible than any other book of antiquity. So simply put, the Bible, it was collected over years and years of time. And short answer, no, the Catholic Church did not give us the Bible. The canon of Scripture was decided long before any synod came along and made choices about that. But so getting it into English, though, is a whole nother story that we just really don't have the time to get into. But it took centuries. The Bible was translated, some of the earliest languages, the Hebrew Old Testament was translated, like 100 or 200 years before Jesus in that intertestamental period. The Old Testament Hebrew is translated into Greek. So you have a Greek Old Testament that's called the Septuagint. And you might see in your Bible the capital letters LXX That's just the shorthand for Septuagint. So now you know what that means when you see it. And then some of the earliest translations of the New Testament were into Latin. And that's what the Catholic Church still prefers to this day. And they actually were the biggest opponents to translating the Bible into a more common language like English.
I wonder why, but I think the point is not many people know Latin. So there you go.
Yeah, when you control, it's easy to see that. When you control the information, you don't got to be a conspiracy theorist with your tinfoil hat to see this, but when you control the information and the interpretation of it because it's stuck in a language that no one can read but a handful of priests, you control the people.
Yeah, we have it in English, and we already have varied translations and people that have discrepancies about the translation. So I imagine in a language that people didn't even know. So
yeah, and so I'd highly encourage you. I'm not going to do it justice. I don't have time, and I'm just not the proper historian to go over it, but there are some excellent books out there. I'd highly encourage you to do some research on the process, and I'll probably prepare a better video about this. And so I've made a note of that in this podcast. So now I'm accountable. People are expecting this. I need that kind of accountability in my life.
You'll have it in May. I'm just playing.
Message. Yeah. If we get to summer and you haven't seen any videos yet, start messaging the Exhorter podcast through our Facebook page and bug us.
Yeah. Then I get to bug you.
Bug John. But I'd like to do a more in-depth video on it. I just couldn't do justice now, but it's such a colorful and exciting story about some of the men that first attempted to translate and succeeded in translating and mass producing with the advent of the printing press and try and just get the Bible out there in the common language so that we all can read it, which I think was God's intention from the beginning. So it's a very great story about how the Bible came from Hebrew and Greek to eventually in English and what we have today. But I think we're more focused in this brief episode on the versions we have before us today, the modern English versions. Can we trust them? Why are there so many? Why are they different? Well, basically, there's two schools of thought. And if we want to talk about translation differences, the reason why your version of the Bible might read differently than mine, it boils down to just a couple of reasons. And one of them is, you could say this a number of different ways: translation style or your approach to translation. Kind of two basic schools of thought here. You've got your formal equivalence, and that just means literal. You're going word for word. And right away, if you're a serious Bible student, you're nodding along saying, yep, I want translations that are literal. And I'm right there with you. I agree. But there is a caveat with that. So you've got the literal translations, but there are some problems. Sometimes things can be too literal.
Like literally translating something straight to English, and the fact that even if you know Spanish and English, the words just don't match up.
Yeah, well, and you get some idiomatic expressions or phrases that mean one thing in a language or at one point in history that maybe means something different now. Imagine if, and this is where, as much as you and I might like that literalness to it, we have to get comfortable. I think you just have to accept a certain amount of discomfort with the fact that translation isn't 100% precise 1 + 1 = 2. So imagine if you were given the challenge of translating the phrase piece of cake in that letter. How would you translate that? Would you be literal about it? Because literal is best. We all agree on that. But now your Spanish audience, if you literally translate it as piece of cake in Spanish, they'd be looking for a piece of cake somewhere. They'd be curious as to why is he talking about cake all of a sudden, when you'd probably just want to say muy fácil. It's very easy, because that's what it means. Now, is that the most literal way to translate piece of cake into Spanish?
Yeah, and that's how idioms work throughout the different generations and different languages. Is I worked with a coworker who's Hmong locally here, and he didn't understand a single idiom out there. So like every other day I was telling him of a new idiom, and he'd be like, what in the world does two birds in the hand in the bush, and what does all that mean? And I'd go through and try to explain them, but even sometimes I didn't know what they meant. Well, there's another example we know from down south. Julio and Scott would go down to Mexico, and there was a kick the bucket. That was the phrase.
I think that was a phrase that came up. If I remember the story correct, that Scott was preaching and Julio's translating, and he used the phrase "kick the bucket," and Julio was like, "Well, what's the phrase there?" And I think it's something like in Spanish, it's "you put on your boots" or "take off your boots." It's something like that.
Yeah,
and that has the same meaning, but it's not
to death.
It has nothing to do with a bucket.
It has nothing to do with
we
dying.
say "kick the bucket" as in like it's what you do before you die, but their expression has nothing to do with bucket. It has something to do with boots. And so that's the challenge. Is as much as we want to lean towards this formal equivalence, this literalness, it isn't always the best. And I'll just, spoiler alert, I'll just say my two favorites that if you want to know what translations does Kyle recommend without any reservations whatsoever, New American Standard, specifically the 1995 version, or the New King James Version. If you read either of those two, I feel like you are absolutely getting what God intended for you to have. All the information is there. There is no blatant errors. But if I have any criticism against those two versions, it's that sometimes they can be just a little too literal. And even like from one language to another, like I said, it's never as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. The syntax, the order of the words in a sentence can be very different. Let me read for you. I pulled up my Greek interlinear. Let me just read John 3:16. This is the most literal word for word that you can get. Thus for loved God the world, that the Son, the only begotten, he gave, so that everyone believing in him not should perish, but should have life eternal. So you can follow that. You can understand it, but it doesn't. Let's just be honest. If that's the way your Bible read, would you look at it as a page turner?
Some do.
Yeah. Well, you'd probably look at that and be like, hey, it's
some really enjoy that.
Yeah, it's not the average reader that's not the order of words, the placement of nouns and verbs. And look, I don't English very good myself, but so on the other side of this, you've got the dynamic equivalence. So that's your main reason number one why we have different versions is just there's different approaches. Some of them are going to be a greater emphasis on literalness. Others are going to be more what we call dynamic, and that's what you think of. It's like a thought for thought rather than word for word. You're trying to find an equivalent word or an equivalent phrase. So it's less literal and.
So before we leave the word for word, we're talking about New American Standard, the King James Version, the New King James Version.
Specifically the New King James Version.
Now, the ESV, it's still word for word, but isn't it closer to thought for thought? Or is it?
ESV is, I'll save my deeper dive for the video series. ESV is a puzzling mixture. I'll say that it's puzzling to me. That at times it is very literal and
because it's in that camp
and
but
praiseworthy for its literalness,
right?
But there are several examples that I won't get into in this episode.
Contextually thought for thought, and sometimes
there's a number of verses that are just very puzzling to many Greek experts, and that just so it does seem to be more or less in that literal camp, but
well, I look forward to that one because that's it's currently that's like my favorite, but we'll also talk about as we go into it how we address using multiple ones. But the thought for thought, this is like the NIV, the NLT.
Yeah, when you get to more of the dynamic equivalents, the thought for thought, you're looking more like the Net Bible, Christian Standard Bible, which is I like that one pretty well. NIV is in there, and so. The thought here is that you trade some literalness for readability. And that's kind of a blessing and a curse because it's like it's a blessing because it makes it readable and it makes it those versions, the ESV and NIV tend to be more popular among the average Bible reader because of their readability. But then especially like with the NIV, there's some troubling translation choices with the NIV.
Well, and there's been multiple versions of the NIV.
Yeah,
that I was looking at. There's one that's more recent, and where they're doing things like gender neutral language throughout.
Exactly, that is a big concern. Yeah, that's a big concern. One specific example with the NIV is Romans 7 and verse 18. Instead of flesh, which every other single translation you can find will render that word flesh, they translate it as sinful nature.
And
that
leans to.
I'm not a Greek expert. I didn't go to college and study Koine Greek, but I can look at other translations and see that they are the outlier. I can see how that word is used all throughout the rest of the Bible, and I can put two and two together and see that that's.
But that's not the only.
Your Calvinism is showing there, NIV.
That's not the only part.
That's just one example.
Take father and replace it with parents. They'll take men and replace it with warriors. They'll take these things and try to find a more inclusive word for it, and kind of.
Yeah. So that's the problem. Is these versions tend to be more popular, and 90% of them could be very well translated and very accurate, but they also have some very troubling and misleading verses that are translated here and there. And the fact that they're more popular means that they're more people buy into them. And so that's kind of the blessing and the curse with it, is because readability is important.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a spectrum. You get to a point where you sacrifice too much literalness for readability, and now you're not getting the words of God. Because look, an example like Matthew 22, when Jesus was challenged, this is why it's so important. When Jesus was challenged by the Sadducees about the resurrection, and that ridiculous example about the woman that marries the guy and he dies and then marries his brother, and she marries this whole set of brothers, and all right, in the resurrection, who's she going to be married to? And Jesus says, why are you asking me this? You don't even believe in the resurrection. Says, you're mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. And the example he uses, have you not read? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Says, first of all, you make assumptions about being married in the afterlife, but about the resurrection itself. Haven't you read this? And he bases his whole argument on the tense. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, not I was. So that argument, Jesus himself is saying, look closely.
Details are important.
Yeah. In an investigation of the Bible, details matter. So Jesus makes his case. So we want to make sure that we are, and there's all these warnings too, Deuteronomy 4 and verse 2, or at the end of Revelation, chapter 22, you got this warning that anyone that adds to or takes away, they'll have all the curses of this book added to them. And so God gives warnings all throughout. You better not take away or add something to this that isn't there. So those are all the reasons why this is an important question, and we do need to be cautious. So
isn't there a section in between? There's the word for word, thought for thought. There's a meaning for meaning.
Well,
wouldn't that be the happy medium of both? But unfortunately, there's only.
Well, the sad thing is that
God's
the
word
NIV
translation
or the ESV that we talked about, those are the happy medium, so to speak, because then you get to the other. If we're looking at this like a spectrum, and that's why follow us when we start doing the videos, because we'll have graphics and cool things. If we put this on a spectrum, you'd have on the far end, paraphrase, and that's where you get to like the Message, New Living Translation, Contemporary English Version. And so those are, you're not even really going thought for thought at that point. You're just trying to reinterpret.
Basically taking a whole paragraph or a whole section of the Bible and just rewriting it in your common tongue.
And here's where I'm going to give some, what might seem like contradictory advice here. Is I will wholeheartedly and without reservation recommend New American Standard and the New King James Version. If you want precise, if you want accurate, I can confidently say read those two versions. There are some other versions that, like the ESV, I think it's a good reader if you have a Bible for studying that's more about precision, and then you have a Bible that's more for reading if you just want to read larger portions of text. in a fashion that's a little easier to understand, and you're just looking for what's the overall message of this book or letter, there are some that I can more cautiously recommend, like the ESV. I think it's a good reader.
I do it slightly different. I have the ESV study Bible. So what I do is I look at all the commentary or study notes based upon what I'm getting in the ESV and see if it makes sense.
Yeah.
But then again, like, I think that's what you're trying to say too, is what I feel like a lot of us do when we're in a Bible study. We'll have the Bible app open or something with two different versions in it. And we're looking at like 3 versions at the same time, because when you start going like expository, getting right deep into verse by verse Bible studies, you are looking at the Greek. You're looking at everything, trying to understand that tense and things. And so I think it's good to have the multiple books open.
Well, and sometimes I like to read the Holman Christian Standard Bible or something like that, or the Net Bible. And I'm looking for variations, maybe something that helps me see this verse a little differently. I'm not looking for something that contradicts the New King James Version that I might be studying out of. But
sometimes I'm looking at a thesaurus, trying to see if there's any other descriptor words that make sense to that.
Just help you see it. Because again, it's not like there's any number of words. If you pick one word in English and translate it to Spanish, there's a couple different words that may be equally accurate and fair choices. So, I said,
do you think there is a problem if someone focuses on one translation and believes that, and narrowly believes that is the only one to look at?
I think you should be cautious against thinking there is one, because the translation process is done by man, and man is fallible. So to think that one translation is perfect, I think that's a mistake. But if you have a preferred translation that you believe is accurate and you like to stick with that one, I don't think there's a problem with that. And I'll give another caveat to this. When it comes to reading some of the more dynamic or even paraphrase-esque versions, I think some of that also depends on what part of the Bible are you reading. Because I can say The Voice is not a version that I really recommend to anybody unless you're reading poetry in the Bible, which is all figures of speech, idiomatic expressions, symbols. So I don't really want literalness. So let me just read Lamentations. When's the last time you read Lamentations, right?
Last time you...
Yeah. So in The Voice, verse 1 begins with it's like an expression, AAGHH exclamation. Lonely is the city that once bustled with life. Verse 2 begins with bawling. She weeps without constraint every night. I'm just going to read the first sentence of each verse and see if you can catch on. Carried off to a foreign place. Despair permeates the very dust of Zion's roads. Enemies of Jerusalem have gained the upper hand. Faded beauty, this daughter Zion. Gone are the days that she remembers. Hideous must be Jerusalem's crimes. Do you see the thing going on there? It's going through the alphabet. That's what we call an acrostic. Most translations lose the acrostic motif, which is there in the Hebrew. They go through all 22 characters of the Hebrew alphabet in succession, and you see that through 4 out of 5 of the chapters of Lamentations in the Hebrew. And so, I wouldn't necessarily recommend The Voice. When you read that version for a book like Lamentations, which is poetry, it can show you some things that maybe a more literal translation is totally skipping over. So Proverbs, Lamentations, Song of Solomon, those books, I feel like I'm a little more open to reading and suggesting some of the more paraphrase type translations, only because paraphrase lends itself to poetry. And so I just love that the acrostic theme is visible in that version of it. But when you're reading something like historical narrative, I want to know the events exactly as they happened. When you're reading the words in red, a sermon preached by Jesus, I want to know exactly what he said. So some of those translations might be appropriate only in some of the more poetic parts of the Bible and really not appropriate for the rest.
Yeah. Just what you said there reminded me of. This is kind of like a squirrel or like a side thought. But when we were talking about the other night about people who place more emphasis on red letters, do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. Forget about Paul.
Forget about Paul.
Paul was a sexist, chauvinistic,
If it's written in
homophobic.
red,
So just look at the words of Jesus. Forget about Paul. He's a product of his culture.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to that kind of thinking. Like that kind of thinking must creep into different translations and come out of different translations. Is how people use it. Is thinking that there is a different weight in the inspired words across the Bible.
You start looking at different translations, and you can see the bias sometimes. Like I said. NIV, Romans 7, verse 18, flesh is translated sinful nature. Your Calvinism is showing. King James Version, Acts chapter 12 and verse 4, it, for some puzzling reason, translates the word for Passover as Easter, which Easter was not at all attached to the Christian religion.
Catholicism is showing.
Yeah, and so it's a product of its time and culture, and some of that shows there is no reason that it should be translated Easter at all, other than the fact that it was translated in the
and how
17th century.
How confirmation bias can that be for people to see that in there and now think, well, Easter is a holiday that is ordained by God. It says it in the Bible, Kyle. You know, the words are in there, and unfortunately that's how I think people can get in the trouble of misusing the translation game of looking for translations for words and things that meet their needs or meet their goal. That's just confirmation bias, or that's just finding something to support your predetermined goals of what you would want to find from that scripture.
Yeah. So that's one reason that explains why we have so many different versions is the approach to translation or the style, whether it's literal or dynamic. And so we've had some really good discussion about that. Another main reason why there's differences in translations is the fact that languages evolve. And that's the main problem with the King James Version is I don't want to say it's a bad translation. My main critique is it's an outdated translation. And so that's why we have some different versions. And every few decades, another version comes along that seems to surpass earlier versions because, well, we use the English words, even in our own language. It's not even a matter of from Greek to English. It's from ye olde King's English to modern English. And the King James Version is just a prime example of that. It's confusing to read the King James Version. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 18, I'll just share a few favorites. He is able to succor them that are tempted. Colossians 2 and verse 23, not in any honor to the satisfying of the flesh. I don't even know what that means. Psalm 37 verse 8, fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. I don't talk like that, and I don't know anyone that does.
Well, that's also, can you imagine if there was a translation done by Generation Z? It's like, do not wear fine adornment, do not wear bougie stuff, right? Or we have seen a drastic change in, I thought some of ours in the 90s and everything were, cool. Like they're opposites. Like we went with bad and cool and stuff. But now nonsensical things like salty is like feeling jealous. Like there's so many different terminologies that they're really having fun with this language. So I would be afraid of this generation.
Yeah.
Any version made by this generation.
Jude 1 verse 9, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a railing accusation. Our good friend Anthony called it the Durst version because he saw that verse and said, what does durst mean? My personal favorite, James chapter 1 and verse 21 in the King James Version, wherefore lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness and receive with meekness the engrafted word. So there's just a lot of examples like this. 1 Peter 3 and verse 1 talks about that wives be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may be without the word, be won by the conversation of the wives. Okay, when we use the word conversation, we think of talking. So how can she, without a word, talk to? So, but go back 300-400 years ago, and conversation meant your ways, your behavior, conduct. So the words change. So that's another major reason why we have different versions, is the English language is evolving, or I think you made a good point that it's more like de-evolving, but it's changing over time. And with texts and memes, we're headed right back to hieroglyphics. One final reason why we have some differences in translations, and I will go very surface level with this, is the textual basis. What manuscripts is your translation based upon? And there's several families of transcripts out there, or manuscripts out there, and I'm talking the ancient documents that we base our modern English versions off of. And you have the Alexandrian text family, which is found surprisingly in Alexandria and around that part of Egypt. And this is where we get some of the oldest translations. So you have the Codex Sinaiticus, which is dated to like the mid 4th century. So like 350 something AD, just a couple hundred years after Jesus, which is remarkable. Codex Alexandrinus, which is 5th century, and Codex Vaticanus. So you get some of the oldest complete New Testaments of this text type. And it's written in the uncial type Greek language, which is all capital letters. So it's an older style of Greek. But then you have the other type, the other major, there's several families, but the two main ones, you have Alexandrian and then the Byzantine text, which is more like 6th to 14th century. But you have about 5,000 examples of this type. So that's the question. The Alexandrian text, and by the way, the Byzantine is the minuscule. It's a later version of Greek that has uppercase and lowercase. So it's a little different styles of Greek in each one. And the question is, with the Alexandrian text, it's closer in date, but the Byzantine is closer in location to where these events actually happened, even though it's farther away, the date that they were written. So that's the question, is earlier better or is more better? We have more Byzantine texts, even though they're later. The Byzantine text is what you get the King James and the New King James from. Everything else is going to be based largely on the Alexandrian text types. And bottom line, you're going to find some differences between those two text families, but none of them are surprisingly major. You're talking about discrepancies between the spellings of words. And again, languages change. In English, do you say a or an? Do you add that n at the end of it? There are rules that are kind of loosely followed, and over time they erode. You see the same thing in all languages, including Greek. And so when people say there are tens of thousands of differences between all the manuscripts, what they mean is there's differences in spellings, but we still know what word they're trying to write. There are discrepancies where you've got 2 or 3 manuscripts that omit this verse entirely, but you've got 4,000 over here that have it. So I'm thinking that's the mistake, and the 4,000 that have it, that's a pretty good number supporting it. So you do find differences between these two text families, but and so the debate between the New American Standard and New King James, they do come from different text families. But I grew up reading the New American Standard, and then for reasons, I switched over to New King James primarily as my preaching Bible a few years ago. I haven't found anything that I'm like, this is shockingly different. This is wrong. My New American Standard didn't say this, but there's minor differences here or there.
I'm curious as to what your grandpa used.
I think he was New American Standard.
Mine was New King James.
So no surprise. There we go. No surprise there. Yeah.
I mean, we grew up, every Bible I got from my grandparents and everyone was New King James. That's what we did.
So in closing, I hope I didn't give you more information than you needed, but enough to pique your interest in maybe reading a little bit about the history of some of the men that translated the Bible into English. And hopefully our videos will come out soon, and I'll be able to dive a lot deeper into some of these topics and reviews of specific translations. But my advice is, don't be afraid to branch out a little bit. There are reasons why I can recommend the New American Standard and the New King James. But I don't want to say that you shouldn't look at other versions especially given the context, if you're reading poetry especially, lean on the more precise and literal translations for understanding and interpreting the text. But if you want some good Bibles that are for reading, there's some good versions out there, but you got to do your homework. And I don't have time to really go through each version right now. But just be sure you do your homework on this.
I think that's why we need to make sure that we are handling the word of truth correctly, as he says in 2 Timothy 2:15. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. So that's the importance of us being students, lifelong students, looking at God's word and making sure that we're finding the things that we need to know. So.
Yeah. Ultimately, this is God's revelation. The Almighty has revealed himself and his will and his thoughts and his mind and his love for all of mankind in the pages of the Bible. And I want to make sure I'm reading exactly that, nothing more, nothing less.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kyle, for that. I think it's really helpful to really understand the differences between them and then try to use them, in harmony with each other. And when you go into study, always have a couple translations up to compare with. But obviously, as he's saying, some are better than others. And I kind of challenge everyone out there to look at their translation, think of how they started using it and why they like it, and maybe challenge you to look at a couple other ones that Kyle has mentioned that feel very, it's hard to say good.
It's okay to put your NIV on the bookshelf and let it get some dust on it.
Yeah, it's hard to say, you only use the good ones, but I think you know what we mean. So I appreciate you listening in on this, and if you found this valuable, go ahead and share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time.